Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our medical device webinar. My name is Ed McMahon. I'm the CEO of Epec Engineered Technologies. We appreciate you taking the time today. We hope that you both find this informative and useful, and looking forward to being able to provide you with as much information as possible. To start, let's go over a couple of housekeeping things. First, because we have everybody muted, and it makes it easier for us to manage the webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat box down on the question box on the bottom right-hand side of your dashboard. That way we'll pick a couple of questions at the very end to answer. And then number two, for any questions that we don't get to, we will get back to you specifically, and then we will post the questions and the answers on our website along with a copy of the webinar when we are finished. So to get started, as many of you know, Epec is in our 61st year as a leading designer and manufacturer of built-in electronics. What this slide demonstrates is the number of companies who are the best and brightest in the medical device industries, but who are also customers of ours today. And this is where we have built this level of experience, and why we wanted to present this webinar to all of you today, to kind of pass on some of the information that we've gleaned from working with these folks over the past several years. Our experience in the medical device industry encompasses all of our products. Traditionally, we started with just bare printed circuit boards, but over the past couple of years, we've become extremely involved with custom battery packs, flex and rigid flex printed circuit boards, and user interfaces. So today, we're going to give you some information on all of those different products. As everyone knows, electronics play a major role in medical devices today. And what this diagram demonstrates is the different pieces of equipment that Epec has worked on over the past 60-some-odd years. Everything from critical life-saving defibrillators to simple things like electronic thermometers. But as you can see, I don't see any time in the near future where electronics is not going to play a big role in medical devices. So the scope of our discussion today, we'll start with really talking about an introduction, which is the challenges that we have seen in the design and manufacturing of different medical devices. And the objective is really what we hope that you get out of this discussion. The case studies, what we will do is bring on our very experienced product managers, Derek Dixon for user interfaces and Paul Tomei for flex and rigid flex circuits. And we'll outline some specifics around case studies where we have worked with different device manufacturers, talking about the device itself, the solution, the challenge that we face, and the solution that we provided. So to get started, everyone knows that medical devices, especially electronic ones, have unique characteristics that other industries do not. Starting with washdown and waterproof requirements, these devices many times are in environments where bodily fluids get on them and they need to be washed down, and being able to understand that they need to be washed down and waterproof resistant are things that we're familiar with. Backup power with many medical devices. A disruption in the power supply cannot disrupt the performance and the operation of the device, because they're life-threatening if it does, and it has to be taken into consideration when designing a medical device. Voltage spikes are becoming a very big issue because many components that go on a lot of these electronic products cannot manage voltage spikes. So we have to be prepared to manage it in a different way so that when these voltage spikes do happen, we can handle them inside of the device. Portability, everything from just moving a patient from one room to another inside of a medical facility, to the fact that a lot of the patients these days want to still be able to be portable themselves and bring their medical devices with them. It's important that we understand the challenges around that. And then lastly, the durability part of it. Many of these devices go through an awful lot of harsh environments. We saw a video a couple of weeks ago where one of the defibrillators that we supply printed circuit boards into was being tossed around the back of an EMT vehicle, and then after it got tossed around for 3 weeks, had to work, and it's one of those things where you just don't take that into consideration for most industrial type devices. As far as the next part of the introduction, I want to talk a little about the regulatory environment. Obviously, as everybody understands, building a medical device requires a lot more than a standard industrial or consumer product. The final product, the individual components, and the manufacturers themselves sometimes may be required to have many different types of approval. These approvals can add significant time to the product design cycle and require significant commitment and investment by a manufacturer. Everything from FDA requirements to CSA UL registration to even DOT IATA compliance for batteries. And many companies with the medical device industry don't understand that compliance, but if you are selling a lithium-ion battery or lithium polymer battery, you have to have that certification, and it does add significant time to a design cycle. So what do we want to get accomplished today? Specifically, we're going to talk about two things. First, we're going to talk about some of the newest PCB technologies to help medical device manufacturers understand the benefits and the challenges of using these new technologies and what to watch out for as you're utilizing them in your design, because as they are tremendously helpful in creating new products, they also create some challenges that you need to be aware of. And then as we talk, we're going to bring in our product managers to really talk some specifics about individual case studies that we have done in the past so that you can understand some of the different things that we've done. So getting started, we wanted to talk about some of these new printed circuit board technologies. As everybody is aware, everything is getting smaller, and that trend is only going to continue. So having said that, tight lines and spaces, the picture you see there on the right is a board that we currently make that's got 3 mil lines and spaces. It's allowing us to do more with less. It's allowing us to have a lot more functionality with a lot less real estate. And with these types of designs come other things like using laser microvias, blind and buried vias, sequential laminations, and many other high-tech features that typically go along with HDI. But there are some challenges with it, and we'll talk about that here in the next slide. Another technology is solder mask via plugging. As you can see on the right, it's when you take a via that usually is empty top to bottom and you fill it with solder mask. It's typically used in BGA designs where the vias are pretty close to the actual surface mount pad, because the concern is that during assembly the solder would wick down an open via and away from the intended solder surface mount pad, and basically there would be no connection between the BGA and the circuit board itself. It also prevents anything getting into the hole during device operation, depending upon the environment that that's going to be in. And one of the things to be careful of here is that this is not, via fill and regular solder masks are not the same product. Via fill ink is a very different animal with a very high solids content that will make sure that during the curing process you don't see any shrinkage, and it's built precisely for that use. So it adds another process to manufacture the printed circuit board. The in-pad technologies. What you see on the photograph to the right on top is the traditional dog bone BGA pattern. When we first started with BGAs, you'd have this via that would go through the board, which would have solder mask over the top of it, and then right next to it you'd have the open solder surface mount pad where the BGA would go to it, and that would pass the signals to the other layers through the connection. Now we have a new technology called V-in-pad, which you see in the bottom, which is whereby the via is drilled right through the surface mount pad. The via is then filled with a conductive or a non-conductive fill, and then plated over to be able to connect the BGA to the printed circuit board itself. There's two different types of fill associated with that. As you can see from the bottom picture, you're seeing there is an actual cross-section of a BGA where there's a non-conductive fill there, but it's there to provide support for the via pad and then also to keep other contaminants from entering the via. For conductive via fill, which is typically a silver or a copper-based material, it's used when you're trying to move a large amount of heat or current from the one side of the board to the other. Typically, more than not, it's heat, and you're using it to have moving heat away from a very sensitive BGA. So with these two wonderful technologies, there's also some pretty significant challenges with them. And so the biggest two challenges that you see are solder balls, as you can see on the left, and etching defects, which you see on the right. And why these things are difficult and why you need to be prepared for them is because we talked a little bit about the voltage especially. Voltage spikes with these two conditions would create significant problems. We're going to go into next, how to make sure that you don't have these problems. But as you can see, if you have a solder ball in a defibrillator and the defibrillator gets bounced around, that solder ball comes dislodged, you can certainly have a significant problem. Along with that, with the etching defects, you can see if you're talking about it's a 3 mil space between those two traces, and there's a voltage spike, and that is down to 2.5 or 2, you could have some arcing and some bridging and some pretty significant challenges. So how do we avoid these problems? Well, looking at etching of the fine lines, which is what that problem was on the right on the previous slide, the etching process is pretty much based upon the quality of the image that you put onto the board before you do plating. And traditionally, we use the dry film resist with a UV exposure. And that's been the process that's been used in printed circuit boards for the last 50 years. And while that works great until you get to about an 8 mil line, anything below that, it doesn't work very well. So that's why several years ago a new process came out called laser direct imaging, whereby a laser is used to actually image a liquid resist on printed circuit boards to much more highly define the fine lines and spaces and get down to actually 50 microns. And the other thing that it does is that it's dynamic. So it makes changes not only for the board itself, but for the image. So typically there's a misregistration from one corner of the board to the other. And with the traditional film method, there's not much you can do about that because the film is in one plane. But with this type of piece of equipment, it will make the adjustments as it's putting the image on the panel, which not only helps yield in a printed circuit board factory, but also helps make sure the customer is getting consistent product every time. And one of the big challenges of this equipment is that not everybody has it. It's a pretty substantial investment, and that's why if you're using fine lines and spaces, you want to make sure that your fabricator has this piece of equipment. The next problem that we talked about are solder balls on filled vias, as you can see from the defibrillator example that was earlier on. And traditionally, the way that vias would get filled is that a fabricator would use a screen printing process where they would put the material either on a semi-automatic screen printer or a hand screen printer and attempt to force the material down through the holes from top to bottom before they go into cure. Unfortunately, screen printing isn't an exact science. And what happens is that the picture you see on the top of this slide is what happens when you have a screen-filled via. You see a lot of voids and micro voids from top to bottom. Now, as you're processing, it looks like it's completely filled. Unfortunately, this is the cross-section of what it actually looks like doing that process. What happens next is that during the curing process, you get what's called shrinkage. And that material shrinks and creates a convex type condition that you see at the top of that diagram there, which then after you put solder mask over that via, it'll still have that convex like characteristic, which a solder ball can then attach itself to. So that's what happens using the traditional screen printing method of filling the vias. And that's no matter if it's solder mask, if it's conductive or non-conductive product. It's all the same. So what you need if you really want to do this the right way and make sure that you get the product that you don't have this is use vacuum and air-assisted filling equipment. And basically, compressed air is used to force the material into a designated head based upon the size of the via and then through the via. And then all the voids can be taken out because the material is pushed through the via itself, and then the excess material is actually removed by squeegee, but it's actually pressed in further because of the fact that the squeegee is filling from both sides at the same time. What you see at the bottom right is actual via that's filled properly and cured, and at the left is the piece of equipment because you put the machine inside of a vacuum enclosed chamber. Again, the biggest challenge with this technology is a significant investment. Many companies will use the screen printing method, but it's not acceptable for medical applications because it creates that problem as we see above. And for many other applications outside of medical, that's acceptable. But for many medical applications, it is not. What I'd like to do now is pass this on to Derek Dixon, who's our user interface product manager, to go over some case studies around touch screens. Derek?
Thank you, Ed. Good afternoon, everybody. The first case study we're going to review is a touch screen application. The application is for an infusion pump and also a fluid warmer. When we spoke to the customer about this, a couple of things came up as far as requirements. Number one, they wanted to reduce the size that the interface was taking up on the product itself. Secondly, they wanted to add some functionality that using a membrane switch, they were going to be limited. And lastly, they wanted to incorporate some new technology. They wanted to modernize the interface to give the user a different experience. So what we did is this is obviously used in medical or hospital environments. So the people that are going to interact with the device are going to be wearing various different types of gloves. So we went with a resistive touch panel, so it's working on pressure, not capacitance. So we weren't going to have any issues with the type of gloves that the users were going to be wearing. Number two is we actually used a hard coat polyester. As Ed mentioned earlier, medical products are continuously being wiped down and exposed to fluids. And in the wipe down cleaning process, we wanted to make sure that the material was going to stand up to the cleaning solvents and solutions. And thirdly, we had to take into account what was going to be needed to make the change to a touch panel. And they were fairly slight. There were some simple electronic changes as well as some machining. This is an aluminum chassis, so we had to just do a little extra milling of the pocket for the membrane switch, but it was very, very slight. So in all, at the end of the day, what we ended up doing was we did expand the functionality of the product, and we maintained the reliability and durability as well. The second case study is going to be a membrane switch application. This product is actually a medical vascular compression device interface. And again, in speaking with the customer, they had some very specific requirements that they wanted to meet. Number one was going to be the display impact protection. Number two was going to be the readability. They needed this is going to be used in different levels of light, and they needed to be readable. And number three, they wanted to integrate a battery light indicator. So what we did is, first of all, we get our hands on the testing and the specs for the ball test that's going to test the display window. And we came up with a solution of about a 60,000 Lexan piece behind the window. So that met all the customer's requirements for the display protection. After that, what we did is we actually supplied the customer with several different samples of anti-glare material for them to test. They came back to us with the solution that they liked the best, and we implemented that as our graphic overlay material. As far as the LED battery indicator, one of the things that was difficult or challenging in that situation was the tightness of the LEDs and the installation. So we were able to kind of really pack those in. We're usually a little bit tighter than we normally like to put LEDs, but that was part of their requirement. One other thing I need to mention is we did touch base on washing down the products. And one thing that also this part incorporates is a continuous gasket of adhesive around the perimeter. So when this is getting washed down, there's not an open or a break in adhesive all around the perimeter for water or fluids to get into the circuit area, so it's well protected. So anyway, the membrane switch ended up being a very cost-effective solution for this home use product, which had some limited functionality. And again, we still maintain the requirements of reliability and durability that's necessary on the medical product. So that's it for my portion of it. And next, I'd like to introduce Paul Tomei. Paul is our Flex and Rigid Flex product manager. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to cover a couple of typical flex and rigid flex circuit applications that we encounter in the medical industry. The first being a medical communication device that was responsible for or be used for secure communications of patient records and information within the confines of a medical facility. The customer's requirement in this case had multiple facets to it. Extreme high density interconnect because of their packaging restrictions, combined with very high speed signal integrity requirements, and ultimately, as is common throughout all of the medical products that we manufacture, the highest degree of reliability available. The solution for this application became a 4-layer rigid flex circuit, which is a hybrid construction of typical printed circuit board technology with flex circuit technology to create one homogeneous unit without any discontinuities. The features and benefits that this brought to our customer was we were able to meet their controlled impedance requirement for their high-speed signal communications. We were able to build in two-sided component assembly capability in the rigid portions, which alleviated many of their packaging restrictions and facilitated the overall design. EMI and RF shielding was incorporated into the design to prevent any disruption of the operation of the unit. The hybrid construction of the design itself, rigid printed circuit board and flex hybrid, improved the reliability tremendously over typical solutions due to the fact that the number of interconnects required to accomplish this function were dramatically reduced. With the flex and the rigid flex being one homogeneous unit, it's looked upon as having no additional interconnects. And each interconnect is looked upon as a potential source of failure. So as such, eliminating those interconnects vastly improves the reliability of the design. And lastly, from a manufacturing and the design perspective, the parts were manufactured and QC'd to the very highest standards in the industry, specifically IPC 6013 Class 3. And the design rules were followed per IPC 2223C in order to use the most reliable materials and constructions possible. Next slide, please, Ed. The second case study is a little bit more of a straightforward solution, but still had some intricacies to it. And this was a flex circuit that was used within a CT scanner to affect a very tight interconnect requirement between adjacent printed circuit boards within their design that were located, they're oriented at a 90-degree angle to one another. Customers' requirements, again, very high density. While the unit itself is fairly large, they actually had a very, very tight packaging restriction at the required interface between the two adjacent PCBs. And ultimately, as is common denominator with all medical designs, the highest degree of reliability was an absolute must. The part also required a significantly high degree of flexibility, and that was as a byproduct of the multiple insertions and removals that the part would see due to the calibration requirements during initial system configuration and also potential later on field service requirements. And lastly, as due to the function that this is a rotating assembly, having a very low weight to the part itself was a fairly important consideration. Ultimately, the solution became a very high density, one-layer flexible printed circuit, which had the mating connectors soldered directly to the flex circuit. The features and benefits of the design was that we utilized a combination of a polyimide coverlay and standard LPI solder mask configuration to accommodate the assembly requirements of the connectors to ensure that there were no solder shorts and that reliability requirements were met. And within the flex area, polyimide coverlay in order to give us the flexibility, reliability, and robustness required for the lifespan of this part. An additional element, which is not very common but was very relevant to this design, was the, as you can see in the upper image, the addition of epoxy strain reliefs at the interface between the FR4 stiffeners that supported the component assembly or connector assembly areas and the flexible portion within. And the function of those was, again, to provide the highest degree of reliability while this part was handled during the calibration and multiple insertion removals required so as not to create a crease at the edge of the flex or the edge of the stiffener and potentially create a reliability concern. And lastly, as per the first one, the part was designed and manufactured according to the very latest IPC specs, IPC Class 3, in order to provide, again, the absolute highest degree of reliability for the customer's application. Back to you, Ed. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Paul. And for our last case study, we're going to talk about an application where we took a sealed lead-acid battery and we converted it to a lithium chemistry for a customer. In this application, it was for a portable bodily fluid warmer for military vehicles. As you can see to the right there, it's a pretty good-sized sealed lead-acid design. And on every military vehicle, they had these fluid warmers, but they also had to have one of these batteries as well. These batteries themselves weigh about 9 pounds. So their objective to us was reduce the size and the weight by 50%. Their strategy was if we could take, rather than have one of these sealed lead-acid batteries on every one of the vehicles, if we could have one that was half the size and half the weight, then the medics could then attach one of these battery packs to their belt, carry it around with them, and we wouldn't need to have so many batteries in the field, and it would reduce the amount of testing and maintenance as well. Now, along with that, they wanted us to be able to improve the performance because they wanted to be able to heat the fluid faster, and they needed more power, which is the lithium could bring. So what we did is we worked with them to redesign this from a sealed lead acid to lithium iron phosphate to the highest technology by A123 systems. So how did it work? Well, first of all, a scope of work is created. Now, that's obvious when you're looking at a new project, but in a project like this, you should expect your vendor to really manage the process of helping you to create the scope of work. And really, it's understanding precisely what it is that you need and what functionality you need so that the scope of work is best put together by a vendor who really knows and understands the battery technologies. And then I start understanding the timing around the process. So batteries, unlike many other electronic products, take a long time to develop. Not only just the actual prototypes, because you have to design all of the software, the firmware, the plastics need to be developed and tooled. There's a lot that goes into a lot of the high-end batteries. And then you go into your UL and CE approval, which could take 8 to 10 weeks. And then with lithium-ion batteries and lithium polymer batteries, you need a UN DOT approval. For any lithium product that's going to go on a commercial aircraft, you have to have this approval. If there is the off chance that it can go on, it has to go on. It has to go to this UN DOT approval. If you want to ship it overnight air, it has to go on get UN DOT approval. So what are the long-term challenges that you have to start to think about as you're putting a scope of work like this together? Well, the first is end-of-life cells. One of the biggest challenges is that a lot of the big manufacturers know in advance when the products that they're making are going to go end of life, and it's really important that as a customer that you understand that you're working with a product that's got more than a year or 18-month shelf life from a manufacturing perspective, because you don't want to spend your time working with a cell only to have it not be able to buy it within 18 months. And then, is it compatible? One of the reasons that I put the A123 sign up on the last slide was that, as everybody knows, A123 is a pretty high-profile company that had to go through some financial challenges. So the reality is that you can't take one manufacturer's battery and drop it into a design like this and have it work. There's a whole bunch of additional firmware and software things that need to be changed, and you have to go back through the UL and the CE approval. So that's really important to understand, that if you wanted to make sure that you never had an issue with supply, that you may want to have more than one cell approved in your design. And then when you talk about dual approval, one of the challenges is that while you may have it designed for 2 cells, if you don't go through the UL or CE and the UN approval, the DOT approval, if you want to substitute another cell, you have to go back through all those approvals again. And unfortunately, it can take anywhere from 8 to 18 weeks to get all those done. Then the next generation ICs, people like Texas Instruments and Linear Technology changed their their data sets and how they and products they manufacture quite often. So you need to make sure that you're working with the latest technology, even if it's just from the perspective that it's going to be available the longest, and you don't have to then make sure that you're going to have to go back and start all over again. So when you're doing this, a couple of things to look out for. One is, does the vendor have the right relationships? And this is critically important because many of the highest technology companies in the battery industry, like Texas Instruments, like Sanyo, like Panasonic, like Linear Technologies, have a group of people that they partner with, like an Epec, where they have these deep dives where you get to go by invite only. They talk about their technology roadmaps. They talk about the lifespan of some of their existing products so that the vendors know to shy you away from or to keep you away from products that aren't going to have the lifespan that you're looking for. And the second thing around the right relationships is that not everybody does a lot of these processes in-house. Whether they outsource mechanical design, they outsource ultrasonic welding, they outsource to PCBA. You want to make sure that they either have that in-house or they have the right relationships, because if they don't, they could certainly find a way to delay your project or then again delay the manufacturing. And then, does the vendor have the proper approved manufacturing facilities? A lot of these companies, like Panasonic and Sanyo, only have a certain amount of companies that they've approved their product to work with. And the reason, especially with lithium, is because of the fact that there are those fire dangers and there are safety hazards, as we've all seen through the recent issues with Boeing and their Dreamliner challenges. So to end, I just want to make sure that everybody's aware that we have design centers and technical support available to you all throughout the country on all of our products, whether it's designing a brand new product or helping improve an existing one or through a typical redesign. All of these folks are available to help go through all those technical issues and answer as many questions or any questions that you could possibly have. So please don't hesitate to contact us, as we're very willing to allow you to use our technical resources as much as possible. So I want to say thank you. As we discussed, we're going to talk about a couple of questions here that have come in. Okay, let's take this first one here. The first question is, do battery packs need to be UL certified if they're going into a unit that by itself will be UL certified? It's a very good question. And the answer is, that we always give, is yes. Because if you're going to ship that battery pack as an aftermarket product or a replacement part, you're going to need the UL certification by itself. And while, yes, you're going to go through inside of your own device, it's best to have the battery pack UL certified as well, because you're going to have to ship it. You're not going to be there while somebody is putting it into the device. So it's best to have the UL protection on there, and it's best for your company for protection. And the second question is, what is ISO 13485 and how does it relate to electronic medical devices? Very good question. ISO 13485 is basically the ISO standard, similar to 9001, that is for the design and manufacture of medical devices. It is very similar to 9001, but there are three specific differences that it brings to the table when it comes to medical devices. The first one is the awareness of the regulatory requirements as a management responsibility. As we talked about in the slide that we had earlier, the regulatory responsibilities of medical devices are vast, and depending upon the type of device, it could be 10 times more than another. So this allows us in the design review, or this makes a company with 1345 in the design review the requirements. And the other two issues are, they have specific inspection, traceability, and validation guidelines for implantable devices and sterile medical devices. And so if you're working with any one of those two, there are certain things that this ISO standard actually helps you identify and helps you manage for those. But a lot of the rest of the processes are around the same as ISO 9000. Well, again, we will post all of the questions, the other questions that we have, along with this presentation on our website in the next couple of days. You can check out our previous webinars at our website, and we will be having several more this year, so continue to look back and look for the emails. Thank you again for all your time, and we appreciate your support.